The courtroom was silent except for the creak of the wooden benches when Judge Thompson lifted the glossy black and white CT scan into the air. The image of a bruised brain glowed under the fluorescent lights, harsh and undeniable, a piece of cold science that carried the weight of my suffering more than any words ever could. He turned the scan toward the gallery, his voice sharp and steady as steel. "This is what your stepfather did to his own daughter." The words rang out like a verdict long before the jury had even begun their deliberations. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my hands trembling slightly, but clenched together in defiance, as every eye in the room turned toward me and then toward the man who had once called himself a father figure. Mark Carter sat there in his dark suit, his jaw tight, his eyes cold, and for the first time since I was a child, I saw something break in his expression. Not guilt, not remorse. Fear. Next to him sat my mother, Linda, her lips pressed in a thin line, as if she could hold the crumbling facade of our family together by sheer force of will. She still refused to look at me, her only daughter, as though by denying my presence she could erase what had been done. My heart pounded against my ribs, not from weakness, but from the fury that had been building inside me for years. Fury that had finally found its moment to be heard. All of it came rushing back in a single flash the night when I said one small word that shattered everything. No, that was all it took. One word spoken too firmly, one word that slipped through my lips with courage I did not know I still had. That one word brought me here to this courtroom, to this moment where the truth was stripped bare and displayed for everyone to see. I looked at the CT scan in the judge's hand, and my stomach twisted as memories assaulted me, dragging me back to the night when my world cracked open. I remembered the slam of the door as Mark stormed into the living room, the smell of whiskey on his breath, the heat of his rage pressing against my skin like fire. I remembered the way my mother wrung her hands and whispered, "Rachel, please, just listen to him," but I held my ground. I remembered the glint in Mark's eyes when I said no, again sharper and more dangerous than any blade. The sound of his fist crashing against the table, the way his voice dropped into that terrifying calm, the calm that always came before the storm. Then came the storm, my head snapping back as he shoved me the sickening crack as my skull met the edge of the wall, the explosion of white light behind my eyes, and then darkness swallowing everything. When I woke up, there were machines beeping beside me and a bandage around my head. I did not know then how close I had come to never opening my eyes again. The concussion had been so severe the doctors said it was a miracle I had survived without permanent loss. But survival was not enough. Survival without justice was another form of silence, another prison. So I sat here in this courtroom, my body still bearing the scars of that night, and listened as my stepfather's crimes were laid bare. The judge lowered the CT scan slowly, his eyes never leaving Mark's. "You did not discipline her. You nearly killed her." The weight of those words filled the room, pressing down on everyone, forcing even the jurors to shift uncomfortably. For the first time since the attack, I felt something new rise inside me. Not fear, not shame. Power. The kind of power that comes only when truth is undeniable, when the evidence is too sharp to be ignored, when even a lifetime of manipulation cannot drown out the facts. I turned my head and locked eyes with Mark. He tried to stare me down to summon the same control he had always wielded over me, but the spell was broken. The bruises on my brain had become my weapon, the very thing that proved his violence to the world. And yet beneath the triumph, there was a deeper ache that twisted harder than the memory of any blow. My mother. Linda sat so close to him, leaning in as though he were the one who needed comfort. Her betrayal burned even worse than his fists. She had seen me carried out of that house half-conscious. She had heard the doctor's warnings, and still she clung to him, desperate to believe in the lie of our family rather than the truth of her daughter's suffering. That betrayal, sharper than any strike, cut through me in that courtroom. It made my resolve crystal clear. If neither of them would protect me, then I would protect myself. If neither of them would tell the truth, then I would tell it louder than both of them combined. And I would begin by telling you everything from the very start so that you can understand how one word, one act of defiance brought me here. Before the violence, before the courtroom and the CT scan that would expose everything. There had been moments that almost looked like happiness if you squinted hard enough. I was 25, newly graduated with my master's degree in sociology, still clinging to the hope that education and work could become my escape. Our house stood in a quiet neighborhood with trimmed lawns and neighbors who waved politely, the kind of place that outsiders would never suspect harbored bruises and secrets. Mark Carter. My stepfather was respected in town, a man who wore pressed shirts and shook hands firmly at community meetings. He carried himself as a provider, someone admired for discipline, and people loved to point out how lucky my mother was to have him. My mother, Linda Carter, reinforced that narrative at every chance. Her smile practiced, her voice trained to echo gratitude. To them, we were the picture of stability. But inside those walls, the air was heavy with control. Mark's voice filled the rooms, even when he was silent, his presence demanding obedience. He decided what we ate for dinner when the television could be turned on, which friends were suitable for me to keep. He even dictated the time I should return home after work, as though I were still a child who needed curfews. Linda absorbed his rules as if they were commandments, always whispering to me not to upset him. "You know how your stepfather gets," she would say, and those words were both warning and justification. For years, I complied because compliance meant fewer storms, fewer slammed doors, fewer nights of hiding bruises with long sleeves. But after finishing my degree, a small spark of independence flickered inside me. I had been offered a position at a research institute in the city, a chance to use my education and for the first time build a life separate from the shadow of my stepfather. I dreamed of saving money, maybe renting a small apartment of my own, maybe even breathing air that did not taste like fear. I could almost imagine weekend mornings with coffee and peace evenings where I decided who came through my door. That fragile vision of freedom became my anchor. Still at home, I tread carefully. At dinner, I answered questions politely. I endured Mark's lectures about responsibility, and I ignored the way he tracked every movement I made. Linda praised him for keeping the family together and scolded me for being distant. "Why can't you just appreciate what you have?" she would sigh. But she did not know that appreciation was impossible when every smile was a mask stretched over dread. My younger half-brother Daniel was 22, still caught between wanting to please Mark and secretly confiding in me that he hated the man's temper. He carried his own bruises hidden under the sleeves of his shirts, but he never confronted Mark directly. He counted on me to be the brave one, though bravery in our house often looked like silence. The thin illusion of peace carried on through those weeks after graduation. Outwardly, it seemed as though we were an ordinary family preparing for summer, but beneath it, the tension coiled tighter each day. I could sense Mark watching me more closely, as though he could feel the shift in me, the small flame of independence I was nursing. He wanted obedience absolute and unquestioning, and he could not stand the thought that I might be slipping from his grip. The happiness was brittle, no more than glass ready to shatter at the smallest strike. It was during this fragile time that he first brought up the idea that would ignite the explosion. He mentioned investments needing my cooperation, needing my signature. My mother nodded along without question. Daniel lowered his gaze, and I felt the walls closing in. I remember thinking in that moment that I could either surrender and lose myself forever or hold on to that fragile vision of freedom I had begun to build. It was a choice, and soon it would demand an answer that would change everything. The illusion of peace shattered the day Mark Carter placed a stack of documents on the kitchen table with the kind of casual authority that made my stomach knot. He said it was just paperwork for an investment, nothing complicated. Nothing that should concern me, except for the simple fact that he needed my signature. I glanced at the papers and saw numbers that made no sense, loan terms that stretched into decades, obligations far beyond anything I could afford. It was not my loan, not my responsibility, but he wanted my name on it because mine was clean, because I had no debts, no blemishes, and because he believed my compliance was guaranteed. He leaned forward, his voice smooth, but his eyes sharp, and told me this was for the family. "You want to see us succeed, don't you, Rachel?" My mother. Linda sat across from him, wringing her hands nervously but nodding along. She said things like, "You know Mark has a plan, and Mark only wants the best for us." Words she had repeated so many times they had lost all meaning. Daniel sat beside me, his head low, avoiding eye contact torn between loyalty and fear. I felt the heat of Mark's stare, the pressure of my mother's pleading, the suffocating silence of my brother, and inside me something cracked. No. The word left my mouth quieter than I intended, but it carried weight. Mark blinked, surprised at first. Then he leaned back slowly as though recalibrating his control. "What did you say?" I said no, my voice stronger the second time. "I am not signing anything." His jaw tightened, his nostrils flared, and I could see the storm gathering in his expression. Linda gasped softly and shook her head, turning to me with eyes full of fear. "Rachel, please do not do this. He only wants what is right for us." But I kept my gaze fixed on Mark. For the first time in years, I did not lower my eyes. I did not fold. I saw the flash of something dangerous cross his face, a promise of consequences, but I refused to back down. The silence stretched until it was unbearable. Then he pushed the papers toward me so hard they slid across the table and landed in my lap. "Sign it." His voice dropped low, threatening. My hands shook, but I placed the papers back on the table. "I will not." That was when his smile appeared, the cold, humorless smile that had always come before the worst nights. "You think you have a choice," he said, and the way he said it made the air in the room heavy. Linda burst into tears, begging me to reconsider, saying I did not understand what was at stake, but I knew exactly what was at stake. If I signed, I gave him control of my future, my credit, my chance to ever build a life of my own. If I refused, I invited his fury. For years I had chosen survival through silence, but that night, silence was not enough. I stood at my knees weak, but my back straight, and I repeated no. Mark's chair scraped against the tile as he rose slowly, towering over me, his shadow swallowing mine. He said nothing more, just stared at me with those predator eyes, and in that moment, I knew the choice I had made would not be forgiven. He left the room without another word, Linda following him in tears. Daniel staring at me with a mixture of admiration and terror. "You should not have said that," he whispered, his voice trembling. But deep inside, I knew it was too late to turn back. A line had been drawn. I had spoken the one word that stripped Mark of his control, and for a man like him, that was a declaration of war. The night it happened began like so many others, heavy silence settling over the house, as though the walls themselves were bracing for impact. I had spent the day at my new job trying to focus on data sheets and research proposals, but every keystroke had been haunted by the memory of Mark's stare when I told him no. When I pulled into the driveway, his truck was already there, the living room light glowing like an ominous beacon. I remember pausing in the car, gripping the steering wheel, wondering if I could just drive away and never come back. But the thought of my mother and Daniel inside, the thought of abandoning them, froze me. I stepped out, my legs trembling. Inside the house, the air smelled of whiskey and cologne, thick and suffocating. Mark sat in his chair like a king on a throne, a glass of amber liquor in his hand, his eyes fixed on the doorway as if he had been waiting all day for me. Linda hovered near the kitchen, her face pale, wringing a dish towel until her knuckles whitened. Daniel sat on the sofa, eyes darting nervously between us, unable to speak. "Sit down." Mark said, his voice calm but laced with menace. I did not move at first, but the weight of his stare dragged me forward. I sat on the edge of the couch, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out the ticking of the wall clock. He set down his glass with deliberate precision. "You embarrassed me, Rachel. In front of your mother. In front of your brother. You made me look weak." His words dripped with venom. I opened my mouth to answer, to defend myself, but he slammed his fist against the arm of the chair, the sound cracking through the room like a gunshot. "No, you do not get to speak. You will listen." His face twisted, veins rising in his neck, and I saw the man behind the mask. The man he kept hidden from the neighbors, the man who thrived on power. He rose slowly, every step toward me, measured his shadow stretching across the carpet until it consumed me. I tried to steady my breathing, tried to remind myself that I had survived worse nights, but nothing had prepared me for the storm he unleashed. He grabbed me by the arm, yanking me to my feet so hard my shoulder wrenched painfully. "You will sign those papers," he hissed, his face inches from mine. I shook my head, whispering no again, and that was the spark. His hand shot to my throat, squeezing just enough to steal my breath, his eyes blazing with fury. Then he shoved me backward, my body slamming into the wall, the plaster rattling behind me. I gasped, pain shooting down my spine, but before I could regain balance, his fist connected with the side of my face. The world tilted violently, colors bleeding into darkness and then snapping back into brutal clarity. I heard my mother scream, "Stop, Mark, please," but she did not come forward. She did not intervene. She wept in the kitchen doorway, her voice weak, her body frozen. He struck again this time with the back of his hand, and stars exploded across my vision. I stumbled, reaching for the table, but he kicked the chair out of my way. I collapsed to the floor, the rug scratching against my skin, and I tried to crawl backward, but his hand was in my hair, dragging me up, jerking my head back so hard my neck cracked. "You think you can defy me? You think you can tell me no?" His words burned, his spit hitting my cheek as he shouted. My tears blurred everything, but I remember the sheer hatred in his voice, the kind of hatred that no family bond could temper. Then came the blow that changed everything. He slammed my head against the corner of the table, the sharp edge biting into my skull with a sickening crack. White-hot pain seared through me. My ears rang. My body convulsed. The room spun and spun until the walls were melting away. I could hear Linda wailing Mark's heavy breaths, Daniel shouting, "Dad, stop!" But none of them reached me fully. I fell limp, my body crumpling like a broken doll, my head screaming with agony. My vision tunneled, fading to black at the edges, and I felt the warm trickle of blood sliding down my temple. The last thing I remember before darkness claimed me was Mark's voice, low and cold. "That will teach you." Silence swallowed me. When I opened my eyes again, the sterile glow of hospital lights replaced the chaos of home. The rhythmic beeping of machines greeted me steady and impersonal. My head was wrapped in bandages, the pain dull but constant, radiating deep inside my skull. My chest rose and fell shallowly, and every breath felt like climbing a mountain. I was alive, but I was shattered. A nurse leaned over me, her eyes filled with pity, telling me to stay calm, that I was safe now. Safe was a word I had forgotten the meaning of. But in that moment, bruised and broken, I felt something flicker inside me, something that whispered, this was not the end. This was only the beginning of a war I would no longer fight in silence. When consciousness returned fully, I was lying in a hospital bed, the antiseptic smell sharp in my nose, the steady beeping of machines reminding me I was still alive. My head throbbed with a deep ache that pulsed behind my eyes, and every time I shifted, the pain shot through me like lightning. A nurse adjusted my IV and whispered that the doctor would be in soon, then left quietly, the curtain swaying as she disappeared. I tried to sit up, but the room tilted and I collapsed back against the pillows, gasping. The sound of footsteps drew my attention, and a tall man with kind but serious eyes entered. Dr. Evans introduced himself as the neurologist handling my case. He held up the CT scan, pointing gently to the dark shadows where the trauma was visible. "Rachel, he said your concussion is severe. You are lucky to be alive. If the impact had been slightly stronger, you could have suffered permanent brain damage or worse." His words settled over me heavier than any blanket. He explained the recovery process, the medication, the risks, but all I could focus on was the undeniable proof in his hands. The scan was evidence objective and cold, yet it carried my truth. For years, my pain had been hidden behind walls and excuses, but now it glowed on a medical image no one could deny. Before I could respond, another figure rushed into the room. Uncle Henry, my mother's older brother, his silver hair disheveled, his lawyer's instinct shining in his sharp eyes. He came straight to my side, taking my hand gently, his voice a mixture of anger and comfort. "You are not alone anymore, Rachel. I should have stepped in sooner, but I promise you this ends now." Tears welled in my eyes, not from weakness, but from the release of years of silence. Henry's presence was a lifeline, an anchor pulling me back from despair. He asked me what happened, and though my throat tightened, I forced myself to say the words. "Mark did this." He nodded grimly. We will make him answer for it." A few minutes later, Claire Dawson appeared, my best friend since college. Her face pale with shock, but her arms open wide. She carefully embraced me, mindful of my injuries. "Rachel, I am so sorry. I should have pushed harder when I saw the bruises before." She promised she would testify that she had already spoken to neighbors who had heard the shouting that night. Her loyalty wrapped around me like a shield. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of isolation lift slightly. I was no longer a solitary target. I had people who believed me, people who would fight alongside me. When Dr. Evans returned to check my vitals, he looked at Henry and Claire, then back at me. "The good news is you will recover. The better news is you have evidence that will stand in any courtroom." I stared at the glowing scan still clutched in his hand and realized he was right. That image was more than a medical report. It was my weapon, my voice, when mine had been silenced. Lying there, surrounded by Henry's steady strength and Claire's determined loyalty, I felt something shift inside me. The fear that had defined me for so long gave way to something fiercer. For the first time, I began to believe that justice might be possible, that Mark's reign of terror might finally end. Hope flickered where despair had lived, fragile but real, and I clung to it with every ounce of strength I had left. The following days in the hospital blurred together, each hour stitched with painkillers, whispered conversations, and the constant beeping of machines. I drifted in and out of restless sleep, my head pounding whenever I moved too quickly, but my mind remained sharp with the memory of Mark's fury. Dr. Evans visited frequently, his calm explanations grounding me. He told me the swelling in my brain was being monitored closely, that I would need weeks of rest, and that I should avoid stress. His eyes, however, betrayed what his professional tone tried to hide. He knew the blow could have killed me. He reminded me again that the CT scan was irrefutable evidence of violent trauma. When he left, Uncle Henry leaned over my bed, his jaw tight, his voice low. "Rachel, you must press charges. You cannot let this go." My throat tightened. Fear swirled inside me. Mark had connections in the community, friends on the police force, people who saw him as a pillar of discipline. What if they did not believe me? What if this backfired? Henry squeezed my hand firmly. "This is not just about belief anymore. This is about evidence, witnesses, medical reports. We have everything we need." Still, fear lingered. Mark's rage was unpredictable, and I knew he would not hesitate to strike again if he thought I had betrayed him. My mother visited one evening, her perfume filling the sterile room. She stood by the foot of my bed, her face drawn, but her eyes hard. "Rachel," she said, "please do not ruin our family. Do not take this to court. Mark regrets what happened. He was only trying to teach you respect." My stomach turned at her words. Teach me respect. The bruise on my skull pulsed in answer. I whispered through clenched teeth. "He almost killed me." Her lips pressed tighter, her silence louder than any denial. She left quickly, unable to meet my eyes. After she was gone, I stared at the ceiling for hours, torn between the desperate desire for my mother's love and the harsh truth that she had chosen her husband's power over my safety. Claire arrived later that night with a folder in her hand. She sat beside me and spoke with urgency. I spoke to the neighbors. Several heard the shouting and the crash. "They are willing to testify." She handed me a list of names, and I felt a flicker of relief. I was not invisible. People had heard, and they would speak. The next morning, Dr. Evans came with another set of scans and said quietly, "Rachel, if the blow had been an inch lower, you might have lost the ability to walk or speak. You must understand how close you came." He looked at Henry, then his voice firm. "She must protect herself." Henry nodded, already preparing notes. "I will file for a restraining order immediately. Mark will not be allowed near you." His words were steady, but I could hear the edge of personal anger in his tone. Later that day, he returned with legal documents. "Rachel, you will need to give a full statement. It will be difficult, but it will protect you and Daniel too." Daniel visited that evening, slipping quietly into the room, his face pale. He sat on the edge of the chair and whispered, "I heard them talking. Mark said, if you do not sign, he will make sure you cannot work again, that you cannot have a future." My stomach clenched, but my resolve hardened. He had already tried to destroy me physically. I would not let him take my life away piece by piece. I reached for Henry's hand and nodded. We will go to court. That night, as I stared at the CT scan illuminated against the light box on the wall, I felt the fear inside me transmute into fury. That image was not only proof of what he had done, but also a promise that the truth could no longer be buried. I made a vow to myself in that hospital bed. I would no longer whisper. I would no longer hide. If Mark wanted war, I would give him one armed with the truth he could never erase. Once the decision to pursue legal action was made, Uncle Henry began digging into Mark's finances with the precision of a man who had spent decades studying contracts and courtrooms. At first, I thought it would simply reveal a mountain of debt, but what surfaced was darker, uglier, and more intentional than I could have imagined. Henry sat beside my hospital bed with a stack of papers and his reading glasses perched low on his nose. Rachel, he said, your stepfather is drowning in debt. Credit cards, maxed-out loans, unpaid gambling withdrawals scattered across his accounts. He was trying to use your clean record to secure another loan. My chest tightened as I listened, realizing that his fury at my refusal had not been just about obedience. It had been about survival. His survival and my future was the currency he planned to spend. Daniel slipped into the room quietly one afternoon, his eyes avoiding mine until Henry excused himself to take a call. My younger brother sat with his hands clasped, trembling slightly. He whispered, I heard him talking to Mom. He said if you do not sign, he will make sure you cannot work, that he will make you so broken you will never leave. My stomach twisted as I absorbed the confession. Daniel's voice cracked when he added, he told her it was better if you just learned your place. The words pierced me deeper than any blow. It confirmed what my gut had already suspected. The violence had not been random. It had been planned, a calculated punishment for daring to resist. When Henry returned, I told him what Daniel revealed, and his face darkened. This is no longer only assault, Rachel. This is coercion. This is control. We can use this. That night, I replayed every conversation with Mark over the past year, suddenly hearing them in a new light. His lectures about loyalty, his demands for obedience, his obsession with my finances. It had all been grooming me to become his pawn, his safety net against the collapse of his own reckless empire. Even more painful was my mother's silence. She had known enough to understand his intentions, yet she had still begged me not to go to court. She had chosen him even as my blood stained the carpet. Claire came by with more news from the neighborhood. She told me several neighbors had seen Mark driving away in a rage on nights when shouting had rattled the street. One older neighbor admitted she had almost called the police before Linda intercepted her with a forced smile and excuses. My own mother had been covering for him, hiding the evidence of his spiraling control. The betrayal made my chest ache worse than the concussion. I realized my family home had been nothing more than a stage where appearances were rehearsed and lies were scripted. Mark's financial ruin was the hidden script, and my mother had played her part by keeping the curtains drawn. Henry worked late into the night contacting old colleagues and gathering records. He showed me proof that Mark had attempted to list me as a guarantor on forms without my consent, forging my initials on one draft. That revelation left me shaking with rage. He was not just violent. He was desperate enough to risk prison long before my defiance pushed him over the edge. As the pieces came together, the bigger picture emerged with cruel clarity. Mark's attack had not been about a single refusal. It was about ensuring I would never again have the courage to refuse him. He wanted fear to become my cage, dependency to become my leash. But lying in that hospital bed, surrounded by Henry's steady presence, Claire's loyalty and Daniel's fragile bravery, I knew he had underestimated me. The concussion that nearly silenced me had instead given me evidence, and evidence was louder than any scream. When Dr. Evans returned to check my reflexes, he reminded me gently that recovery would be slow. But his final words stayed with me longer than his medical advice. He said, "Rachel, you have survived the worst already. Now you must decide what to do with survival." That night, I stared at the ceiling pain throbbing in my skull and made my choice. Survival would not be enough. I wanted justice, I wanted truth exposed, and I wanted Mark to face the consequences he had evaded for years. The conspiracy of debt control and violence was unraveling, and this time, I would not be the one left in silence. The day of the trial dawned gray and heavy, the kind of morning when even the air seemed to carry judgment. I walked into the courthouse with Uncle Henry at my side, Claire close behind, and Daniel trailing silently, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. The hallways smelled faintly of old paper and polish, and every step echoed as though announcing our arrival. My heart pounded, but I kept my head high, determined not to shrink. When we entered the courtroom, Mark was already there, sitting tall in a dark suit, his expression carved from stone. He glanced at me briefly, his lips curling in a faint smirk, and then turned back to his lawyer as though I were nothing more than a nuisance. Beside him sat my mother, Linda, her eyes fixed on the floor, her hands clutching her purse so tightly, her knuckles shone white. She did not look at me, not once. Judge Thompson presided with an austere presence, his gavel striking the wood with a sound that silenced the chatter. The prosecution began by laying out the facts. Dr. Evans was the first to testify, explaining the CT scan in precise medical terms. He described the severity of the concussion, how close I had come to permanent damage, and how the injury could only have been caused by significant blunt force trauma. He held up the scan as the judge and jury leaned in the image, undeniable. My stomach clenched as I relived the pain, but I forced myself to breathe steadily. Then came Claire, her voice trembling at first, but growing firmer as she recounted the years she had seen bruises, the nights she had heard shouting over the phone, the fear etched into my words when I confided in her. She looked directly at me, her eyes full of loyalty, and said, "Rachel never lied. She was terrified, and now you all know why." The jury shifted uncomfortably, listening, absorbing. Daniel's turn came next. He walked slowly to the stand, his shoulders slumped, but when he raised his eyes, his voice was surprisingly steady. He admitted he had heard Mark threaten me, that he had seen him lose control before, that our mother always told him to stay quiet. His testimony was a knife slicing through the illusion of family unity, and I watched Mark's jaw tighten with every word. The prosecution rested, and then it was the defense's turn. Mark's lawyer painted him as a strict but loving father figure, a man pushed beyond reason by a disobedient stepdaughter. And then came the twist I had dreaded. Linda took the stand. My mother swore on the Bible, her hands trembling, and then she looked up and spoke words that made my blood run cold. "Rachel exaggerates. She has always been dramatic, always looking for attention. Mark never hurt her. She tripped that night." My breath caught in my throat as the betrayal sliced deeper than any blow. The courtroom murmured in shock, but Linda continued, her voice growing stronger as she clung to her version of events. "Mark is a good man. He provides for us. He only wanted Rachel to be responsible to help the family." She shook her head as if disgusted. "I begged her not to bring this to court, but she would not listen. She is tearing our family apart." Tears stung my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I clenched my fists under the table, fury and heartbreak warring inside me. Judge Thompson silenced the murmurs and turned his stern gaze toward me. The defense ended their argument with Linda's words echoing in the room, but then the prosecution called Dr. Evans back for rebuttal. He held up the CT scan again, his voice unwavering. "With all due respect, no one trips and sustains this type of head trauma. This is not a stumble. This is blunt force impact delivered with significant power." He looked directly at Mark. "Only violence can do this." The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He lifted the scan himself, turning it toward the jury. "This is not discipline. This is not an accident. This is what your stepfather did to you, Rachel." His voice carried like a hammer striking the final nail. Gasps filled the courtroom, and I felt a surge of power wash through me. For so long I had been silenced, doubted, minimized, but in that moment the truth shone undeniable. I raised my head and locked eyes with my mother. She finally looked at me, her face contorted with shame, or perhaps stubborn loyalty to the man beside her, I could not tell. Her betrayal still burned, but the evidence spoke louder. When closing arguments ended, the jury retired to deliberate, the room buzzing with tension. I sat with Henry's hand steady on mine, Claire's shoulder brushing mine. Daniel sitting stiff but present. Every second felt like an eternity. When the jury returned, the foreman rose and delivered the words I had been waiting to hear. Guilty. The word rolled through the courtroom like thunder, striking down Mark's smug composure at last. I exhaled, my body shaking with relief, fury, and sorrow all at once. Judge Thompson set sentencing for the following week, but in that moment, justice had spoken. Mark turned his head toward me, his eyes still filled with venom, but his chains rattled when he tried to rise. For the first time, he could not touch me. And though my mother wept beside him, clutching his arm, I knew she had chosen her side. I had lost her perhaps forever, but I had gained something far greater. I had gained my voice back. The sentencing came a week later, the courthouse once again crowded with reporters, neighbors, and strangers who wanted to witness the fall of the man who had hidden behind a mask of respectability for so long. I walked into the courtroom steadier than before, no longer the trembling woman in a hospital gown, but someone who carried truth like armor. Mark sat at the defense table, his once confident posture now sagging under the weight of inevitability. Linda was beside him, clutching his hand tightly, as if her grip alone could change the outcome, her eyes swollen from tears that I could not tell were born of love or shame. Judge Thompson entered his gavel, striking once, and the room silenced instantly. He read through the charges again, his voice measured and calm. Aggravated assault coercion, intent to cause severe bodily harm. He looked directly at Mark, then at me, before pronouncing the sentence. Up to 15 years in state prison. The words landed like a stone, dropped into still water ripples of shock, moving through the room. Linda gasped loudly and broke down in sobs, throwing herself against Mark's shoulder, as if she were the victim being punished. She cried out, "This is unfair! She is lying! She has ruined our family!" But her words barely registered against the gavel's final strike. Mark's face remained cold, unreadable, but his knuckles whitened as the bailiffs pulled him to his feet and fastened the cuffs around his wrists. For once, he did not have the power to fight. Reporters swarmed outside the courthouse, shouting questions about betrayal, justice, and family secrets. Headlines soon blared across newspapers and television screens. Respected community man sentenced for brutal assault on stepdaughter. The story spread quickly, painting our once carefully crafted family image in the harsh light of truth. For me, the aftermath was both a release and a wound. Linda refused to speak to me, her phone calls filled with accusations when she did bother to answer, blaming me for tearing her life apart. She appeared on the courthouse steps one afternoon, declaring that her daughter had betrayed her, and the community's sympathy evaporated when people remembered the CT scan. Neighbors who once admired her now whispered with contempt. Daniel quietly packed his things and left the family home, unable to endure the tension. He told me in hushed words before leaving, "You did the right thing. I cannot stay there anymore." His loyalty, fragile but real, reminded me that not all ties were broken. Claire stood by me through it all, her testimony earning her respect in the community and cementing her place in my life as family chosen rather than forced. The media attention was overwhelming at first, cameras flashing whenever I stepped outside strangers, sending letters praising my courage or confessing their own stories of abuse. It was strange to become a symbol, but I realized it was bigger than me. Every interview, every article carried the proof that silence could be broken, that even in the face of betrayal from those meant to protect us, truth could prevail. At night, I still felt the ache of loss, not just of my health or safety, but of the mother I once hoped would stand with me. Yet as I stared at the scar on my temple in the mirror, I knew the wound had been transformed into testimony. Mark was behind bars, his voice no longer booming through our home, his control severed by chains and iron bars. Justice had carved its path, leaving scars, but also space for something new to grow. 2 years later, I stood at the podium of a modest community center, my voice carrying across a room filled with women and men who had survived stories that mirrored my own. The walls were decorated with banners for the nonprofit organization I now worked for, a shelter and advocacy group dedicated to victims of domestic abuse. The fluorescent lights glowed warmly, and for the first time in years, I felt not like a survivor clinging to fragments of hope, but like a leader shaping something new. My hair had grown longer, the scar at my temple still faintly visible, but I wore it without shame. It had become my badge, my reminder that silence could never again define me. Mornings began differently now. Instead of dread, I woke to the sound of my alarm in a small apartment I had chosen myself, filled with sunlight and books, a place that smelled of coffee instead of fear. Daniel visited often stronger now that he had broken away from the toxic grip of our mother. He was finishing his degree, talking about a future in counseling. Inspired, he admitted shyly, by what he had witnessed in me. Claire remained constant, her loyalty unwavering, and together we organized workshops that taught others how to recognize warning signs of abuse and how to build safety nets before it was too late. On my desk at the office hung the CT scan that had once been waved above the courtroom. I kept it framed not as a symbol of pain, but as a symbol of proof of victory. Whenever doubt threatened to creep in, whenever the memories of Linda's betrayal haunted me, I looked at that image and reminded myself that the truth had been carved into science and law, undeniable and permanent. My mother Linda lived alone now. Her reputation in the community had crumbled after her courtroom performance. She still called occasionally, her messages alternating between pleas for reconciliation and venomous accusations. I learned to let them sit unheard. The woman I once begged for love had chosen her loyalty, and I had chosen mine. I grieved her absence as one grieves a death, not sudden but inevitable, and then I moved forward. Mark remained behind bars, his 15-year sentence beginning to feel like a lifetime as each year passed. Reports reached me occasionally that he was struggling to assert dominance in prison the way he once did at home, that the man who demanded obedience now found himself ignored. When people asked me if I forgave him, I answered truthfully. Forgiveness was not mine to give. Accountability was, and that was what he had received. The closure did not come in a single moment, but in hundreds of smaller ones. It came when a young woman in one of my workshops raised her hand and said, "Because of your story, I left before it was too late." It came when Daniel hugged me after one of his classes and whispered, "I am proud to be your brother." It came when I stood on a stage at a local university delivering a lecture about resilience and saw students scribbling furiously, their faces alive with recognition. Closure lived in the ordinary, in the laughter that returned to my voice in the nights I slept without fear. On the anniversary of the trial, I walked to the river near the courthouse, holding the notebook I had kept during those dark days. I read the entries pages filled with fear and desperation, then I closed it and let the wind carry the pain away. I whispered into the dusk, "No more silence." That simple phrase had become my creed. Rebirth was not a single act, but a life rebuilt from shards stronger for the breaking. As the sun set over the water, golden light spilling across the ripples, I realized the story that began with violence had ended with something far greater. It had ended with freedom with purpose, and with a voice that could never again be silenced.